An anonymous viewer emailed in to ask about comparing things in English and German. I don't remember the exact wording of the question. I'm going to put it up on screen. It was something like, why do I get told I'm wrong when I say something like, das Ding hier ist mehr wichtig als das Ding da? Literally, this thing here is more important than that thing there. That's a great question because that is literally how you would phrase it in English. And this is a common pitfall that language learners can fall into. I'm not specifically talking about English learners moving to German, but any language moving to any other language, there's a temptation to phrase things in your target language word for word the way you would phrase it in your native language, and that very often just doesn't work. This is one of those examples. The word forms that we use to compare things in English and German are called comparatives and superlatives, and they're handled fairly similarly across the two languages, but there are some important differences to be aware of. So let's talk about comparatives and superlatives in English and German and see how the two languages contrast and compare. By viewer request, this is Lernen und Fahren. Comparatives and superlatives. Let's start with a refresher of how this works in English, and then we'll move to German and see what we need to adjust when we're speaking in German. Now, when we want to compare two things in English, we use a special form of the adjective called a comparative. To form the comparative, we start with the adjective and we add an ER. Sometimes we have to play with the spelling a little bit in order to get there, but the general rule is that we add an ER to the adjective. So small becomes smaller. This object is smaller than that object. Great. Big becomes bigger. Note that we double up the G's there to maintain the pronunciation. That's a wonky English spelling thing. Pretty becomes prettier. Notice the Y changes to an I. That's more English spelling wonkiness. But the general rule here is that we add an ER to the adjective to form the comparative. There's another type of comparator that we can form in English called a superlative. This is when you want to take a comparison to the extreme limit. So in English, to form the superlative, you start with the adjective and you add an EST. And again, sometimes you have to play with the spelling, but small becomes smallest, big becomes biggest, we adjust the spelling, pretty becomes prettiest. Now that's great, but there's a problem here. There's a problem in English in that many adjectives simply don't follow this pattern. They should, but they don't. So for example, the word helpful in English, you might expect to be able to say something like Heinrich is helpfuler than Carl, but that's not a word in English. Same with important. Project A is importanter than Project B, and Project C is the importantest project of all. That should work. It fits the pattern. But it doesn't. It doesn't work. Those aren't words in English. Why? Well, it turns out there's a rule in English, and it's really weird. The comparative and superlative word endings can only be applied to adjectives if the adjective in question is one syllable long, or if it's two syllables long and it ends with the letter Y. What? Who's coming up with these rules? I mean, that's just crazy arbitrary, but I mean, there it is. So small, single syllable, great. Smaller, smallest, no problem. Pretty, it's two syllables, but it ends with a Y, so again, no problem. Prettier, prettiest. But helpful is two syllables, and it doesn't end with a Y, so it can't take those suffixes. And important is more than two syllables, so it doesn't matter what letter it ends with, it also cannot take that suffix. So, what do we do with these adjectives that don't fit the pattern? Well, we have helper words in English. The helper words in the positive direction for comparisons are more and most. So you can be more helpful than someone else. A project can be more important or it can be most important. Great. Notice how, in English, there are no suffixes that can move in the negative direction. So the ER suffix for the comparative means more, and the EST suffix for the superlative means most, but there's no suffixes that go in the other direction. You have to use helper words. The helper words in English are less and least. So small, for example, even though it fits the pattern, it can take these suffixes in the positive direction. There are no suffixes in the negative direction, so you have to use the helper words. This project is less important than that project. This project is the least important. Okay. Now there's three types of comparisons that we can do with these word forms in English. I'm going to call them the superior comparison, the inferior comparison, and the equality comparison. The superior comparison, we take the modified form of the adjective and we use the word than. So Heinrich is taller than Kristen. Project A is more important than Project B. Kristen is richer than I. What? Shouldn't it be Kristen is richer than me? Well, it depends who you talk to. In modern English, you can use a subject pronoun or an object pronoun there interchangeably. It wasn't always the case. Historically, if you want to be formally correct, we're comparing two subjects, so they must both be expressed in the subject case in English. So, Kristen is richer than I is technically correct, but nobody speaks that way in modern English. In modern English, it would be more common to say Kristen is richer than me. And I think they're pretty much interchangeable in modern English. But hold on to that thought. Keep that in the back of your head, because we will revisit this point when we talk about German. The inferior comparison in English, we've got a couple of options. The first option is to use the not as blank as. So Kristen is not as tall as Heinrich. Another way to say that in English, and it's just a different way of phrasing it, it means exactly the same thing. You can use the helper word here. You can say less blank than. So Kristen is less tall than Heinrich. Project A is less important than Project B. It means the same thing as Project A is not as important as Project B. It's just a different way of phrasing it. Now for the equality comparison in English, we use the construct as blank as. You can also sometimes use the construct so blank as. That's a little old-fashioned, and I think historically the difference there was that as blank as could be used either for positive comparisons or negative comparisons, whereas so blank as was only used for negative comparisons. So Kristen is not as tall as Heinrich. You can also say Kristen is not so tall as Heinrich. They mean the same thing, I think. But as blank as might be a little more common in modern English. The so blank as construct is still around, and you'll still see it, for example, if you use it with a verb. Kristen didn't so much as look at me. Didn't so much as look at me. Another way to say that in modern English would be to say that Kristen didn't even look at me. I was expecting Kristen to sit and talk with me for a while, but she didn't even look at me. She didn't so much as look at me. So the last thing I will say about the equality comparison in English is that you can throw an adverb in front of it to either strengthen the comparison or soften it, depending on what you want to say. So Carl is exactly as tall as Heinrich. They have exactly the same height. I'm stressing the equality there. Or you can soften it a little bit. You can say Heinrich is roughly as rich as Kristen. They maybe don't have the exact same amount of money, but they're pretty close. And they both have more than me. That's all I can say. Okay, let's move on to German. The concepts here are very similar. German also has a superlative and a comparative form. German also has the same three types of comparisons, and most, or if not all, of the same options that exist in English also exist in German. But there's some important differences that we need to cover here, so let's get into it. To form the comparative in German, you take the adjective, you do an umlaut shift where necessary, depending on what vowels are present in the adjective, and then you add the comparative suffix. The comparative suffix in German is er. It's the same as English. In fact, our English comparative suffix er comes directly from German. So small in German is klein. How would you say smaller in German? It's kleiner. It's exactly what you would expect. Great. The umlaut shift can sometimes throw you for a loop because we don't do this in English. The word for warm in German is warm. You might expect the comparative to be warmer, but it isn't. It's wärmer. There's an umlaut shift. The A becomes an A umlaut. Same thing with kalt, meaning cold. If you want to say colder, it's kälter, not kalter. The umlaut shift changes the pronunciation, and it can help disambiguate it, as we'll see when we talk about inflection later. Because warmer and kalter are actual words in German, but they don't mean what you think they mean. Now, the really, really, really nice part about the comparative form in German is that crazy arbitrary rule that we went over in English about counting the number of syllables in the adjective or looking to see what letter the adjective ends with, none of that applies in German. That rule simply doesn't exist in German. That's an English thing. So we can forget that rule. This is great because it means that this is one of the rare cases where English is actually more complex than German. Usually it's the other way around. But here, English has this crazy arbitrary rule that simply doesn't exist in German. So, for example, the word for helpful in German is hilfreich. How would you say more helpful? In English, we need two words to express that, but in German, it's just hilfreicher. Great. Important in German is wichtig. So how would you say more important? It's wichtiger. That's great. That's not a word. That's literally importanter. That's not a word in English, but it is in German. Now we can get into trouble here, as we'll see in these examples, because that speech pattern that's ingrained into your brain is hard to lose. So let's look at the three types of comparisons in German: superior, inferior, and equality. The superior comparison uses the construct of the modified adjective and the word als. Als means than. So it's very similar to what we do in English. So Projekt A ist wichtiger als Projekt B. It's tempting to use the helper word in German the way you would use it in English. Projekt A ist mehr wichtig als Projekt B, but that's not how they say it in German, and that's wrong in German. So, Kristin ist reicher als Heinrich. Great. Again, the umlaut shift, be careful. You might say something like, Canada ist kälter als Deutschland. Deutschland ist wärmer als Canada. Okay. So, final note, Kristin ist reicher als ich. Remember in English when we said that in English you can get away, in modern English anyway, you can get away with using a subject pronoun or an object pronoun in that comparison. But in German, they're stricter about this. When you compare two things using als or using wie, as we'll see in the next examples, both sides of the comparison have to be expressed in the same case. So, because Kristin is the subject of that sentence, she's expressed in the nominative. Whatever's on the other side of als also has to be expressed in the nominative. So, Kristin ist reicher als mich would be wrong in German. You can get away with it in English, but it's technically incorrect German. Kristin ist reicher als ich is correct. Now be careful because it's not always going to be nominative case. You can use als in the object part of the sentence. So, for example, sie mag mich besser als dich. She likes me better than you. Mich und dich are both in the object part of that sentence, and they're being compared using als, so they are both expressed in the accusative case there. The important takeaway is that when you're comparing two things, the two things have to be in the same case. You can't mix and match like you can in modern English. What a lovely day. Holy cow, it's nice out. Let's move on to the inferior comparison. We have the same two options in German as we have in English. The first is to say nicht so blank wie. Notice it's wie and not als. Wie is another comparison word, but it's not interchangeable with als. Wie literally means how, but forget about that because in this particular context, wie means as. So nicht so blank wie is not as blank as. So Kristin ist nicht so groß wie Heinrich. Kristin is not as tall as Heinrich. Great. Another way to say that in German is to use the helper words. Yes, there are helper words in German as well for going in the negative direction. Just like in English, there is no suffix in German that can take you in the other direction. There's a comparative suffix that means more, and there's a superlative suffix that means most, but there's no suffixes for going in the negative direction, just like in English. So you have to use in German a helper word if you want to do that. The helper word for less in German is weniger. You can say Projekt A ist weniger wichtig als Projekt B. Notice that when we use this construct, we switch back to als. We don't say wie there. Project A is less important than Project B. This means the same thing as saying Projekt A ist nicht so wichtig wie Projekt B. It's just a different way of expressing it. Same as in English where we have those two options that mean the same thing. You can choose which one to use. Let's talk about the equality comparison in German. This uses the construct so blank wie. So Projekt A ist so wichtig wie Projekt B. Heinrich ist so reich wie Kristin. Heinrich is as rich as Kristin. Now, just like in English, you can throw words in front of that comparison to either strengthen it or soften it, depending on what you want to say. Projekt A ist genauso wichtig wie Projekt B. Project A is exactly as important as Project B. I'm stressing the exactness of that comparison. Heinrich ist ungefähr so reich wie Kristin. Heinrich is about as rich as Kristin. Maybe they don't have exactly the same amount of money, but they're both pretty rich. Okay, so let's revisit something that we first talked about all the way back in episode 3. Way back then, we talked about two styles, or two ways in which you can use adjectives. This applies both in English and German. There's the so-called attributive style, where the adjective directly precedes the noun that it modifies. So the small cat, the friendly dog, the fast motorcycle. Great. There's also the so-called predicate style, where the adjective is separated from the noun that it modifies by some conjugation of to be. So the cat is small, the dog is friendly, the motorcycle is fast. Okay. In English, we don't really care because the adjective doesn't change spelling or pronunciation depending on which style you use. So you probably learned this in grade school, got it right at the test at the end of the year, and then immediately forgot about it and never thought about it again because who cares? It doesn't matter in English. But in German it does. In German, when you use the attributive style, adjectives undergo declension. And the form of declension that the adjective will undergo will depend on whether you're using it with the definite article or the indefinite article. The definite article is easier because the adjective just takes an E ending regardless of the grammatical gender. So the small cat, die kleine Katze. Klein becomes kleine. The friendly dog, der nette Hund. Nett becomes nette. The fast motorcycle, das schnelle Motorrad. Schnell becomes schneller. Okay, great. It gets a little weird when you use it with the indefinite article, because the adjective now has to take a declension word ending that is going to depend on the grammatical gender of the noun in question. So a small cat would be eine kleine Katze. It stays the same for grammatically feminine. For grammatically neuter, we would say a small motorcycle is ein schnelles Motorrad. We take the es ending for grammatically neuter. For grammatically masculine, it gets kind of ugly here, because the word ending for grammatically masculine declension for adjectives is er. That's the same as the comparative word ending. So a friendly dog is ein netter Hund, but that looks like you're trying to say a nicer dog. But it isn't. It's not the comparative word ending. It's the declension word ending for grammatically masculine singular nominative. This gets kind of ugly. If you want to say a nicer dog, it's actually ein netterer Hund. There's two ERs there. The first ER is the comparative. It means more. The second ER is the declension word ending for that adjective. This sounds a little wonky, and this gets worse because there are a small handful of adjectives in German that already end with er. For example, lecker meaning delicious, or sauber meaning clean. If you want to say a clean dog, it's ein sauberer Hund. The first er is built into the adjective sauber. The second er is the declension word ending. Okay, if you want to say a cleaner dog, it's ein sauberer Hund. What? Yes, it sounds like you're trying to jumpstart a 1950s engine, but it's legit. The first er is built into the adjective, sauber. The second er is the comparative. It means more. The third er is the declension word ending, sauberer Hund. Good Lord, that's terrible. We can mitigate this a little bit by switching to the predicate style. We can say this dog is cleaner. Dieser Hund ist sauberer. Okay, we still have the doubled up ER. The first ER belongs to the adjective sauber, the second ER is the comparative, but we can forget about the declension ER because we don't do that in predicate style. So it's kind of ugly in German, but there are ways to mitigate it at least a little bit. Okay, now let's talk about the superlative in German. To form the superlative, you take the adjective, you do an umlaut shift where possible, and you add the superlative word ending, which is either st or est, depending on spelling. This should look very familiar because, again, we stole this directly in English from German. In English, it's est. Now, when we use the superlative in a sentence, declension is not as bad because in both languages, it doesn't make sense to use the indefinite article with a superlative. What would that even mean? You wouldn't say, this is a fastest motorcycle. What? This is a friendliest dog. What? No, that doesn't mean anything. So in English, you would say this is the fastest motorcycle, definite article, or you might say this is one of the fastest motorcycles, plural, if there's more than one that are about the same speed. But you wouldn't use the indefinite article there. So again, remember, declension in German with the definite article, we just throw an e at the end of the adjective, so it's a little bit easier here. So the smallest cat would be die kleinste Katze. Klein becomes kleinst. The st word ending comes from the superlative, and then we add an e for the regular declension there. So kleinste, die kleinste Katze. The friendliest dog would be der netteste Hund. Net takes the est ending for superlative, and then we throw the e at the end of that for the declension form. So netteste, der netteste Hund. Great. The fastest motorcycle would be das schnellste Motorrad. Schnell takes the st ending for superlative, and then we throw an e at the end for the declension form. Great. Now when we switch to predicate usage in the superlative, something kind of weird happens in German. We have to use am. Am is a contraction of an dem. Literally that means at the. We don't do this in English. We do use the definite article in English. You would say, this motorcycle is the fastest. Okay, great. But we don't use a preposition with it. They do in German. I don't know why. It's weird. Don't try to translate it literally. So in German you would say, dieses Motorrad ist am schnellsten. Okay, we notice a couple of things there. Number one, literally what we're saying there is this motorcycle is at the fastest, but don't do a literal translation there. It doesn't. You're only going to hurt your brain. What that means is this motorcycle is the fastest. The other thing we notice is that schnellst became schnellsten. Why does it take the en ending? Well, we're in the dative case here. Where did dative case come from? An is a bidirectional preposition, as we first covered back in episode, what was that? Episode 6, I think I had a whole speech about bidirectional prepositions. I'm not going to go over it again in great detail. Go back to episode 6. Basically, an can either take an accusative object or a dative object, depending on how you use it. And when you use it with the superlative, it's always in dative case, because we're not describing something that is changing locations. So, an dem schnellsten is correct. Dem, the definite article, is in dative, and the adjective takes an en ending also for dative case. So this project is the most important. Dieses Projekt ist am wichtigsten. And yes, there is a helper word here as well for least. That is am wenigsten. I have the least would be ich habe am wenigsten. The least of what? Well, it depends on context of the conversation. Okay, last thing to cover here is the irregular forms. There are some adjectives in both languages that just don't follow any pattern. Why? They just don't. It's just like verbs. There are irregular verbs that don't follow any conjugational pattern. You just have to memorize them. Same thing with adjectives. There's not nearly as many, but there are a few that you should be aware of. For example, in English we have the word good. You might expect comparative and superlative forms along the lines of gooder and goodest, but those aren't words in English. Instead, we say good, better, and best. Okay, where do those words come from? If you look at it in German, good is gut. So you might expect to see guter und gutest, but nope, they say gut, besser und am besten. And now, when you look at those words, you can clearly see in English where we get those words from. Better comes from besser und best comes from am besten. Along the same lines, we have much in English. We don't have the words mucher and muchest. We say much, more, and most. Where do those words come from? Again, look at German. Much is viel. But instead of saying viele und vielest, they say viel, mehr und am meisten. So, the English word more comes from the German mehr. And the English word most comes from the German am meisten. There's also a handful of irregulars in German that aren't irregular in English. For example, hoch in German means high. So if you want to say higher, you might expect it to be höher, the umlaut shift and the er suffix, but for whatever reason, it's höher. Why? I don't know, it just is. Those irregulars are kind of painful, but you just kind of have to memorize them as you come across them. It is what it is. And there you go. There is comparative and superlative in English and German in a nutshell. The important takeaway is that English is actually, in some respects, more complex than German. We've got this crazy rule about using helper words that you don't have to worry about in German. This is a good thing because it means that German, at least in this one specific instance, is less complex than English, at least until you get into declension. But it's also kind of a bad thing because you have to try to unlearn this rule that's been drilled into your head your entire life. Trying to unlearn something that you've been doing your entire life is very difficult, and it's very tempting to phrase things like Projekt A ist mehr wichtig als Projekt B, but that's bad German. You have to unlearn that rule and train yourself to use words that don't exist in English. Importanter. Projekt A ist wichtiger als Projekt B. It's liberating once you get used to it, but getting over that initial step can be a bit of a hurdle. So, thank you for sending in that feedback. I love getting emails like that. If you've got feedback on this episode, or ideas or requests, things that you would like to see covered in future episodes, please either post them in the comments down below, or use the anonymous email feedback link on the bottom of the website. Your name and your email address will never be shared with anyone. I take that very seriously. It's treated purely anonymously, so send in those emails, keep them coming. That's all for today. We will see you next time on Lernen und Fahren.